Enthymemes are not Aristotle's only contribution, even if he thought it was the most important contribution. In fact, if you knew anything about Aristotle coming into this class, it was probably about his proofs. And the ones you probably knew were logos, pathos, and ethos. And we'll get to those in a minute. But Aristotle, as you read, actually has two kinds of proof. The first kind of proof he calls inartistic or non-artistic proof, depending on your translation. And inartistic, non-artistic proofs are proofs that are used. In other words, the creator of the writing, speaking, whatever it is, doesn't make these up. The creator uses what's already present, already in existence. So this is probably easiest to see in rhetoric that comes in the legal environment. So in court, in a court case, if somebody uses physical evidence, like fingerprints or blood spatter or gunshot residue or eyewitness testimony, footprints that are found at the scene of the crime, shell casings, these are all things that are used. Hopefully the prosecutor didn't make them up. The prosecutor is using these pieces of evidence as a part of the proof of the case. Those are inartistic proofs. They're used. Now the other kind of proof, and the kind that you've probably heard about, are artistic proofs. These are invented. In other words, the speaker or writer comes up with these as a part of the argument. Now most arguments are going to have a little bit of both, inartistic and artistic proofs, especially legal arguments. But even arguments about things political, like what should or shouldn't be done, a lot of times they will use evidence, statistics, or projections, or eyewitnesses that talk about their own personal experiences. And we don't make these things up. They're already there. We're just kind of plugging them in. That's the nature of inartistic proof. But let's talk about the kinds that are created, artistic proofs. First of all, we have logos. Logos is the part of the argument that's reasoned or logical. So when a speaker gives you 3 reasons, or when an essayist sets out a plan in order, maybe with numbers, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, that's logos. You're putting things together in an orderly, reasoned way that's going to make it easier for your audience to follow it. That's the logos part. So don't just think logic. It's really about reasoning. That's logos as an artistic proof. Then pathos is the use of emotion as a proof. And it doesn't just mean making people cry. You might do that if you want a certain result. But getting people to laugh or cry or feel angry or feel sorry for somebody or even to feel happy about something. These are all emotional appeals. A lot of times stories are used as part of emotional appeals. So by telling a story, you're able to get people either excited or incensed or frustrated or something of that nature. Those are pathos appeals. And again, the speaker is thinking these things up. And that creates, what emotion do you want? How are you going to kind of pull it out of people through your use of language? And then the third kind of artistic proof is ethos. And ethos is from the same root as ethical, but this is really about character. Do you make yourself seem like a trustworthy person that your audience should listen to? That's ethos. Now, sometimes you might talk about this. You might mention your experience or your education or your training that makes you qualified to talk about something. That's one way it can work. But a lot of times, it's more basic than that. Have you ever thought about why people dress up in court? Well, some judges require it. But there's another reason why lawyers are generally going to wear suits or some other kind of professional attire. It's because they want to look like they know what they're doing. I mean, even the idea of looking professional, this is ethos. So whatever you do to look professional on any job, you're trying to build that part of your argument. And so dressing appropriately is one way to do that. Using appropriate vocabulary. I don't know what kinds of words you use in your personal life with your friends, but if you're in a formal situation, you're probably going to avoid profanity and slang because you think it's going to weaken your credibility. It's going to make that your personal part of your argument less strong. That's what ethos is about. So these are really important Aristotelian ideas that you were probably introduced to, but I hope that gives you a fuller understanding of how those work together in a piece of rhetoric. Not the only thing Aristotle did. We've already talked about enthymemes a little bit, and I just wanted to add that the common form of an enthymeme in everyday use is an assertion plus a reason. So an assertion because something else. This is a really common way that enthymemes are used. So for example, if you said, I think we ought to eat at BW3 because we had a great experience there the last time. If that's your argument, the part that you're expecting people to fill in is that it's a good idea to eat at places where you've had good experiences before. Now you don't say that, you don't go through the whole deal. You've made an assertion, we should eat here because we had a good experience there last time. You expect people to be able to understand why that's a good reason. That's the common form of an enthymeme. Assertion, because, reason. The other concepts that give us some new vocabulary from Aristotle, and there were other things he wrote about, but we're going to limit it to this and then epilogues in just a moment, are species or divisions of rhetoric based on the audience and what you want from the audience. And those species are this: ceremonial, forensic, and political. Now I'm going to go through each one of them in turn, give you some examples, what distinguishes them, and then tell you why it matters. So first of all, let's talk about the species of rhetoric where the audience is not asked to make a decision. They're just observing. This is called ceremonial rhetoric. And I've given you some other words depending on the way the Greek is translated, because if I haven't already told you this, Plato, Aristotle, Gorgias, all those guys are Greek. The purpose of ceremonial discourse is to either praise or blame, censure. And the focus is honor or disdain. The speaker must know the deeds of the subject. Here's what that means. Ceremonial discourse tells an audience what they already know. And so, you're either praising something or someone that the audience already loves, or you're criticizing something or someone that the audience already hates. Ceremonial discourse is not asking for a decision because you already know how the audience feels about it. So, for example, a eulogy is the classic example of ceremonial discourse. People who come to a funeral are not looking for a fair and balanced account of the deceased's life, right? The people who come to a funeral are there to celebrate and remember the person who is being memorialized. And so the speakers are going to talk about positive memories, happy things, personal characteristics that people like. They're not going to say, and you know what else? Just to be fair, I mean, this guy was a jerk. I mean, some of us here are happy that he's gone. That's not going to happen at a funeral. You're not looking for fair and balanced. You're there to affirm what you think that audience already thinks. Now, the flip side, it's easy to blame people that everybody likes to blame. I mean, terrorists are the subject of some ceremonial rhetoric today. Everybody that talks about terrorists talks about how they're awful, and they should. Terrorism is awful. But that kind of speech, if a member of Congress gets up and makes a speech about terrorism and why it's terrible, they're just affirming what they think their audience already thinks. Now, sometimes ceremonial discourse is not necessarily in a speech form. Things like parades are ceremonial discourse. You're celebrating the 4th of July or Christmas or springtime or Memorial Day or whatever it is. That's the focus of the parade. And you assume that everybody that's there is celebrating the same thing. You're not going to have protesters, we don't like Memorial Day, so we came here to give the other side of the story. That's not going to happen. A parade is ceremonial discourse. If you build a website about how you love ponies, your website is ceremonial discourse. You're not looking to have an argument about ponies. You want other people to come to your website because they love ponies too. Ceremonial discourse. The second species of rhetoric asks the audience to judge what's happened in the past. So, this is called forensic. You either attack or defend if you're doing forensic discourse. You're going to focus on why something is just or unjust. And in order to be successful, you have to know the facts of the case. Classic example of this is, of course, argument in a court of law. So the prosecution is going to attack, the defense is going to defend. Both of them are going to talk about what is just as an outcome, and both of them are going to know the facts of the case. So they're going to use a lot of inartistic proofs as part of forensic rhetoric. But in this case, you are asking the audience to make a decision. You're saying, here's what happened, and you should decide for the plaintiff or for the defense. Crisis communication is usually forensic rhetoric, not necessarily in a court of law, but in terms of public opinion. You're trying to get people to judge your company based on what's happened in the past as being not at fault. You're defending your company against claims that you were responsible for whatever the crisis is. And then the third species of rhetoric is when the audience is asked to judge what should or should not be done in the future. And this is called political. So your question is, should we do or should we not do something? The focus is on the expediency. In other words, is it good for us, or the harm of a proposal? We shouldn't do this because it's bad for us. And this is the part that often gets overlooked in political discourse: resources. The speaker has to know about the resources involved. So if you're proposing something, let's say as a big new government program, you're speaking in Congress, you're going to have to explain how to pay for it. Those are the resources involved. And in a simpler way, if you're trying to get students to join your student organization, which is also political, you're telling them to do something, you're telling them it's going to be expedient if they do this, it's going to be good for them, you still have to talk about the resources. How much is it going to cost? How much time is it going to take? Is there anything they get out of it? A t-shirt, a line on their resume? What are the resources involved? This is a critical part of political discourse that's often overlooked. And even professionals often overlook this. So big bills in Congress, a lot of times the big question is, how are you going to pay for it? A lot of people join that conversation and they never talk about how they're going to pay for it, or where the money's going to come from, or how they're going to change things related to resources that are involved in order to make this plan work. But it's a critical part of political discourse. So let's look at some examples and figure out which kind of political discourse they are. Let's look at these. If Jeb Bush makes a campaign speech in Iowa, well, that's political. He wants people to vote for him. A closing argument on an old Law and Order rerun, clearly forensic. You're asking people to make a judgment, or at least the lawyers in Law and Order are, about what's been done in the past. On September 11th, if people make speeches of remembrance, or if there's some kind of memorial at Ground Zero in New York City, these are ceremonial discourses. We're honoring, we're remembering in positive ways the people who died on September 11th. There aren't really debates about that. If you appeal a grade to me, that is, it's a little bit of both, actually. It's a little bit of forensic because you're saying that your grade was unjust. It's a little bit of political because you want me to change it in the future. It's probably more forensic, though, because your argument is essentially what happened in the past was unjust. Getting people involved in a student organization, political. You want people to do something. You're going to talk about the resources involved. You're going to talk about why it's expedient for them. And of course, the difference it makes is if you've identified the kind of speech that you're making, then Aristotle has given you the things that you need to do to succeed. So that's why it matters. It's not just a matter of putting things in categories. It's understanding what the category is and then knowing what criteria are going to make that speech, that essay, whatever it is that you're doing, effective. The last concept I want to give you from Aristotle, fittingly, is epilogue or conclusion. Aristotle says there are 4 parts that need to be in any conclusion. Make the audience like you and dislike your opponent. Magnify or minimize the leading facts. Excite the required state of emotion in your hearers and refresh their memories. Now you might notice that 3 of these look a lot like artistic proofs. So the first one, make the audience like you and dislike your opponent. Well, that's ethos. Magnify or minimize the leading facts. In other words, kind of highlight, organize the main ideas so that people will take away what you want them to. That's logos, reasoning. Excite the required state of emotion, pathos. And then the last one, refresh their memories. We would say summarize or review. That's common sense to us today, but Aristotle was the one who told us that's the way it should be. Let's look at an example of a great classic epilogue from Abraham Lincoln's second inaugural. With malice toward none, with charity for all, with firmness in the right as God gives us to see the right, let us strive on to finish the work we are in, to bind up the nation's wounds, to care for him who shall have borne the battle, and for his widow and his orphan, to do all which may achieve and cherish a just and lasting peace among ourselves and with all nations. So Lincoln is giving this speech. He's been reelected. It's early 1865. The Civil War in the United States is not finished yet, but it's close to being finished. And so he's speaking not just to people in the North, he's speaking to people in the South that are soon going to be rejoined as part of the United States of America. And look at what he does here. He does exactly what Aristotle said should be done. He tries to make the audience like him. How does he do that? He talks about malice toward none. We're not gonna have hatred. We're gonna have charity or love for everybody. He talks about God. That's going to be something that most of the members of his audience are going to believe is an important thing, an important being. And so these are all ways that he's making the audience like him, that he's seeming more credible. Now, how about his magnifying the leading facts? He's reviewing the things that he thinks are most important for the country's future, that they need to heal, to bind up the nation's wounds, to finish the work we're in, to get things back together. And then look at what he does for exciting the required state of emotion. He wants to care for the soldiers, for the soldiers' widows and orphans. And notice that he doesn't say just the Northern soldiers' widows and orphans, right? He just talks about the people who've borne the battle. And so this is a way of trying to bring people together by getting them to feel sorry for the Confederate and the Union losses in the war. And then, of course, even if you haven't read the rest of the speech, you get an idea of his main points because he has refreshed his audience's memory here. And so even though Aristotle is long gone, his principles are very much with us. By far the most important theorist in the history of rhetoric, we still use most of Aristotle's principles today.